Hi, and welcome to this episode of HR and Cocktails. Today, I am joined by Laura Donahoe of Elite HR Connections, and we are going to talk about rethinking performance evaluations. Performance evaluations have been, quite honestly, the bane of many managers' existence, and today we're going to talk about how we might be able to change that. So thank you for joining me today, Laura.
I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for having me, Kimberly.
Absolutely. So tell our listeners and our viewers about you.
So I've been in human resources for about 20 years now, and about a year and a half ago, I created an online HR community for HR professionals called Elite HR Connections.
Awesome. So tell me about Elite HR Connections. What is that?
It's a one-stop shop HR community for professionals to connect across the nation. We are looking to offer webinars, trainings, recertification credits, and most importantly, the ability to connect and network.
Yeah. And I mean, that's really important for everyone in every profession. But I think HR tends to be relatively lonely because we can't have friends at work. And especially if you're in an organization where you're the only HR person, you really don't have anyone. So to be able to have that network, even if it's virtual, is definitely helpful. And I think it's probably also helpful as it relates to our topic today. So performance evaluations, when you think about performance evaluations, managers are just like, I don't want to do them. And many times they either don't or they don't do them well. So let's just talk about historically, what performance evaluations were like. It was like the annual review and, the rankings, and nobody wanted to tell anybody anything bad. So what have you seen is really the direction that organizations are going with performance evaluations?
So back in the day, well, even recently, employers were using an archaic version of a performance review. And like you said, the ratings, the goal setting, now that part's important. Mm-hmm. But tying the reviews to annual increases, and some of that is just, it's out the door. Mm-hmm. Employers are learning that they don't want to have the ties between both the annual performance review and the increases and things like that. So I think a lot of employers are trying to figure out a new way to go about handling performance reviews. It's been very difficult for some managers and employees and leaders of organizations to get on board with this. So why not revamp it? Yeah,
absolutely. And I do think that, it's a very subjective and flawed process, right? Particularly, I hear managers sometimes say, well, I just want to review them on this. And then you look at the performance evaluation as their job description. I'm like, if you're not doing your job, you don't need to be here. I don't need to review you annually on whether you did the duties of your job, right?
Exactly.
So really, what should be the purpose of the performance evaluation from your perspective?
So we want to make sure that we're setting goals and really taking the employee's performance to another level. I mean, it's one thing if they're just doing a consistent job every day, but how well are they doing it? Are they meeting their goals? Are they hitting their timelines? And so I think performance reviews could really be taken to another level if employees and their managers are truly engaged and they're open to receiving the feedback as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that part of it, too, is really making sure that organizations are doing the hard work. Creating an effective evaluation process is not easy. Mm-hmm. Right? Really identifying competencies, success profiles, what does it take to get to the next level? How do I really manage that? And then training the managers, because the manager training part, that's really where it comes in, right? The rater error, the rater bias, all the HRE, SHRME words that we get, right? So from your perspective, what are some opportunities that organizations have to help their managers do a better job, regardless of what evaluation system they're using?
So one way to do that is to just open up feedback and communication between the employee and the manager, and hopefully building a relationship there where they both feel comfortable to provide the constructive feedback and also receive it. And that could be from both angles.
Yes, and I think that's a really important point, the two-way communication. I think that many times organizations, quite honestly, throughout the employment life cycle, even starting with the recruitment part, they look at it as a one-way feedback loop. Like, you're the candidate, I'm going to tell you what I want from you, and I'll decide if I want you. And it's like, no. People get to decide if they want to come here too. So you need to also have a value proposition. And the same thing, right, as it relates to, the performance review. Because listen, manager, maybe you're not helping me. Maybe you're not effective. Maybe you're not removing hurdles, right?
Absolutely.
And maybe the organization isn't providing me with what I need to be successful. So I 100% agree that it should be a two-way conversation. So when you think about some of the newer things that organizations are doing, what do some of those things look like?
So one way that I've recently worked with an organization to create a more useful performance plan is to actually have more frequent conversations and having about 1 to 3 questions that the manager and the employee get to ask, and have it more of a communication style, but still having it documented.
Yeah. And I think that's important. Oh my goodness. Documentation, document. I was, how when you're in social media and if you talk about anything, then all of a sudden an ad comes up. So apparently I was having a conversation about documentation somewhere that day. And when I opened my social media, there was this banner to sell something, and it was like a little plaque that sits on your desk, and it said, "But did you document it?" So the answer should always be yes. Did you document it? Yep. Yes, please. And documentation can look a lot of different ways, right? It can just be a follow-up email to someone that says, "Hey, I just want to follow up to you to confirm that this is what we talked about in the conversation." And listen, I tell people all the time, managers specifically, understanding is not what we should be striving for. I cannot make sure that people understand, okay? Trust me, I have a 14-year-old. Understanding is not what I'm striving for. I just need you to acknowledge that we had the conversation. So what are some ways that managers and organizations can also help individuals with, from a documentation perspective, to take that feedback and perhaps put it into use?
So one way that I would suggest an approach that might work would be to have the employee receive some questions, like I mentioned before, potentially 3 questions that they can answer and think through, and then have that discussion with their supervisor or manager on a piece of, after they have that conversation, then they put both items on a piece of paper or electronically, and retain that for their records. Now, there's a lot of different ways to do that. You can, like I just said, you can do it on paper, or there are a lot of systems out there, and you could put in an electronic system to track it.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that, the electronic way is something that's useful for organizations because, now that we are in an environment where everybody's not in the same place and, going to your manager's file is not necessarily, an option anymore, it helps with that, as well as an employee has the opportunity to access their own information and kind of go in there, even if they can't edit it, they can at least see the history of the conversation. But, we've been talking for a while and we haven't gotten to the good part, which is the drink. So what type of cocktail would you like today?
A Tennessee version, old fashioned.
A Tennessee old fashioned. All right. Tennessee old fashioned coming up. So Laura, you chose a Tennessee old fashioned. So tell me why you chose it.
So this past year, a couple of my girlfriends and I, we went to Tennessee together and we did a bourbon tasting. And after that, I was hooked.
All right, awesome. Well, I'm hooked on bourbon too. So since this is a Tennessee Old Fashioned, I chose George Dickel because that is a Tennessee bourbon. And this is a little bit of a different spin on an Old Fashioned. So we're going to add a few things that aren't in a traditional Old Fashioned. So we're going to start with our bourbon. We're going to do 2 parts bourbon. I always love that sound. I love the smell too, right? So we're gonna do 2 parts bourbon, and since I have to double it, gotta put a little bit more in here for both of us.
I love the way you do this, Kimberly.
Thank you, right? A little bit extra. And then, as is the case with any old fashioned, you'll put a little bit of simple syrup. I'm not really a measurer, so let's put a little bit of simple syrup. Plus, we're gonna be using cherry juice for this one, so not too much, just a little bit of simple syrup. So now we're gonna add our bitters. I like to use Angostura bitters, but you can use orange bitters. You can use whatever bitters you want, but I like to use these. So we're gonna do about 4 or 5 splashes of bitters. And now we're going to use our cherry juice, and we're also gonna garnish with a cherry, but we have to make sure we have the best. So we have Luxardo cherries. We're gonna put a little bit of cherry juice in there, and this cherry juice is super thick, so just try not to make too much of a mess with it. A little bit more, since this is a double portion, right?
I'll take it. The sweeter the better.
Exactly. And now we will do a splash of orange juice. That looks like more than a splash, but it's okay. All right, so now we're gonna put some ice in our shaker. Even though we're not gonna shake, it's an old fashioned, so we're gonna stir. But we're gonna put some ice in here so that we can get it nice and cold and mix it together. And then, because this is an old fashioned, in our rocks glass, we're going to put a large ice cube. So 1 large ice cube, and then another large ice cube. So when we get ready to strain, we are ready with our ice cubes. So we're just gonna stir. Do you wanna stir while I get our garnish together? All right. So while Laura stirs, I am going to try to get our orange peel together. As you all know, I am not the best at making these peels do what they're supposed to do, but we are going to try to make this look nice and fancy, and Laura's doing an awesome job over here stirring while I try to get these together. All right, so yes. All right, so now we're going to strain into our rocks glasses. That looks beautiful, and that looks beautiful. Perfect. Now we are going to top this, hopefully, with our orange peel. No, that looks okay. Yeah, there we go. Top it with our orange peels, and cheers. Cheers. We didn't even taste it. It's okay. All right, Laura, so we have our Tennessee Old Fashions. Cheers. So we already tasted it when we made it, but we got to taste it again. So let's taste it. Still tasty, just like it was when we first made it.
Amazing.
So I have not done bourbon in Tennessee, but I've definitely done Kentucky bourbon. So you've inspired me to do some Tennessee bourbon. So thank you so much for that.
I highly recommend it.
Yeah, for sure. So, we were just talking before we made our drinks about documentation, the various systems and ways that we can document employee performance. And so I think it's important for managers to understand what documentation should look like and what good documentation is. So from your perspective, what is performance documentation? What should that look like? What should it include and what should it not include? We probably start there, but what should it include?
So one way to start that process is to actually train your managers and have the hard and difficult conversations about what they should and should not be including in those with regard to, obviously, all the legalese, the Title VII laws, and all of the things that we should be following from a legal perspective. So that's the first step, so they know what not to include. Mm-hmm. And then from there, we can also teach them how to set proper goals. There's different techniques with that. So guiding them, I think, and really training them on the proper way to handle these conversations is critical.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And, when we're thinking about training managers and training them on what to say and what not to say, it's really important. Sometimes managers have a difficult time. Like, performance is a little bit easier to quantify in a performance review, but behavior is a little bit more difficult for them sometimes. And so I find that a lot of times we have to help managers with that. So using the I versus you language, and really helping them to understand it's not, you can't say you have a bad attitude because that is subjective, but really what is the impact? When you do these behaviors or when you behave a certain way, this is the impact, right? Because we can measure impact, but I can't necessarily determine what is your bad attitude or measure bad attitude. There's no bad attitude meter, right? Yeah. But we can definitely look at impact to the organization, impact to team, impact to morale, et cetera. And so you also talked about goals. We've talked about goals a few times. Talk to me about goals and the role that they play in performance setting expectations. And when should you start setting goals?
I would start setting goals from one of your first interactions. You want to know up front what the expectations are so you can be held accountable from an employee's perspective, be held accountable for those goals, but also from a manager's perspective of accountability to help them achieve those goals. And if you don't have those set, how do you know where you're going? It's important for both parties to be well aware of what that looks like.
Yeah, and I think that's important because as leaders, sometimes we're not always the best at creating goals that a manager can cascade down, right? So we have our mission, our vision, we have our, here's our strategic plan, but creating those into bite-sized chunks that then can be given to departments, divisions, individuals that can roll up into this is how you help us achieve our long-term goals. So it's not just on the manager, right? So the manager is kind of like the middle person in this goal-setting piece of it, but leadership needs to have large goals for the organization that they're then breaking down to managers that managers can then push down.
Absolutely. It's the manager's responsibility to really work and guide the employee on setting the proper goals and expectations that correlate and relate to the organization's missions, goals, values, all of that.
Yep, absolutely. So, we have to train our managers. We have to document. We need to set goals. We need to communicate those goals. But let's really talk about, because, at the beginning we talked about, the annual review is very difficult. People either don't do it well, don't do it all, definitely don't want to do it. So what are some alternatives to an annual review?
Absolutely. This is a great question. And a lot of organizations are taking this approach lately where they're doing a monthly or quarterly assessment instead of, and by assessment, I mean just that brief 3-question communication piece to more touch base type style rather than, we'll meet once a year and discuss what you're doing. It's more consistent. And that way you have more time throughout the year to actually drive towards those goals.
Yeah. I tell managers all the time that whether you are an actual parent yourself, if you're an aunt, uncle, godparent, whoever you might be, it is a very similar thought process to dealing with children. Not that employees are children. Some of them act like children, but that I think they're children. But at the end of the day, it's very similar. It's about proximity to the feedback, right? So when you have a small child, when you have a 3-year-old, you can't talk to your 3-year-old tonight about something that happened this morning. They're going to look at you and be like, what are you talking about? Like, I have moved on. I have had snack. I have had a nap. Like, what are you talking about? So it's about proximity to feedback, right? And so at the end of the day, if I have something that I'm like, Laura, I need to talk to you about something that happened in January, me talking to you about it in December, first of all, I haven't given you the opportunity to be successful, right? Because if I had had that conversation with you in January, we could have seen improvement along the way versus me waiting to December, you potentially continuing to do the same thing, me getting more and more frustrated, but I haven't explicitly set the expectation. And I think that's another thing. I think that managers don't always explicitly set expectations. They think that people can just read their mind and know what the expectation is. What are your thoughts about that?
And that's a definite downfall.
Yeah.
They need to be very clear in what that looks like. So say one day they have a conversation with an employee that says, I would like to see you do X, Y, and Z better, or could you focus on X, Y, and Z? And then follow up with an email, because that could be considered great documentation. And then you can pull it up when you have your next conversation with them and say, well, you hit all these great aspects and we talked about this and you made that better as well. So you have that documentation and can more easily pull up what the behaviors were.
Absolutely. And so you said that organizations are going to, either monthly or quarterly evaluations or assessments, conversations, and kind of moving away from that annual review. But you also mentioned earlier that, some organizations are not necessarily tying compensation to this review process. So, for years in the world of HR, we kept hearing pay for performance, pay for performance. So how does this tie in, and where does compensation tie in if we're not doing it at this time?
So compensation can always be discussed from a couple different aspects. You can always do your COLA increases, depending on how the economy is doing. And then you can also do merit increases. And that could be done whenever you know what your profits look like for the year. So there are different techniques that I've noticed employers, after their calendar year or whatever their annual financial looks like, they'll make that determination and then do an evaluation of profit sharing.
And so for those of you that might not know what COLA is, it's cost of living adjustment. I know we have so many acronyms in HR, but yes, so cost of living adjustments are definitely something that organizations do really just to try to keep up with inflation to a certain extent, right? And then merit increases. So, again, we've heard so much, and I know growing up in HR, I think we grew up in HR around the same time, about, pay for performance and tying it to those evaluations. So I think that that's going to be an adjustment for organizations, but it makes sense because if you're having conversations on a quarterly basis or a monthly basis, you're not adjusting compensation for every conversation. So there is going to need to be some type of rubric or, line in the sand for when are we going to address compensation and what is that going to look like? And then, of course, as is a lot of the conversation that we're having in the world, period, but particularly in the business world, in the world of HR, making sure that there's equity in how those decisions are made. And equity can mean a lot of things. Equity in, in the job title, equity in, a department in an organization. So it's not always tied to a specific demographic, but just equity in general. And I think if we think about it that way, people can get it can be a little less, difficult for people to manage the word equity when they're looking at compensation. So we've talked about a lot of things, but let's also take into consideration hybrid and remote work. And how do we measure performance and do it in a way that's not subjective for individuals that we don't see and sit with? What does that look like?
So a lot of times people confuse just seeing a person with the amount of work that they're doing doesn't necessarily correlate. So it's important to remember that, are you setting those goals? Are you meeting your objectives? Are you getting the job done? And that's what it boils down to. And are you getting it done in an efficient and effective manner? Because, somebody could be taking 2 or 3 times as long to get a job done than somebody else, but you always, as the manager, have to be tracking that information and setting those clear expectations up front.
Yeah, and we go back to setting expectations because I think that, when organizations were thrust into remote work overnight, literally, in 2020, what I think many organizations realized was that they actually did not have the performance metrics that they needed to have in order to set expectations. So face time was their measure. Did the person come to work today? Did they come on time? Did they stay till 4:00? No, acknowledgement to the fact they might have been standing around the water cooler, walking around talking to the other people in their cubicles, online shopping, exactly, online shopping, all of those things, right? And so at the end of the day, I think what it made us do, hopefully, is really get clear about what are the expectations, what are the performance metrics, And what are you being measured to? So again, as we talked about, the hard work that has to be done on the front end to create a performance evaluation that really does what we want it to do. The same thing about performance expectations in a remote work environment to be able to measure whether someone has been productive or not.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's critical.
It is. It absolutely is. So we have talked about a lot of things, Laura. Is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you think we should talk about?
I think we covered most of the topics around performance reviews and reinventing them.
Yes, reinventing them, not waiting until the end of the year to do this very onerous process of writing a narrative or ranking people
That
or force
nobody
ranking.
wants to do.
And they don't do it in a real way most of the time. There are some managers that do, but many of them just say you did okay, unless you did really bad, and then you did really bad. And so I think that, one of the takeaways that I would want is just for people to really think about what are you measuring and how are you measuring it? And is the current process that you're using really achieving that?
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Laura. I really appreciate you being on our show today.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you, Kimberly, for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you all for joining us on this episode of HR and Cocktails, and we'll see you next time.